standpoint, what I'm seeing is also that the question around purpose is becoming bigger, both at a company design standpoint, at a customer standpoint. Customer's purpose is becoming a bigger deal, values is becoming a bigger deal, and employees' purpose is becoming a bigger deal, which means that the also here looking for the connection and similarity and differences in views, so we can hopefully argue and agree on some things. If we can imagine a future, let's say 30 years from now, where Naluri is awesome and global, obviously doing well in business sense, but also having a massive human impact. And we have reimagined the work environment. We could imagine maybe Human Inc. have helped companies really instill these ways of working that drives curiosity, empathy, purpose in how teams work, how individuals work. I would imagine that there's kind of, it's almost like two sides of the same question, right? There's the health, mental health and physical health, but you also talked about like the stress factors, which then links to how does organizations design themselves? How do leaders lead together? Do we prioritize these things? What's the work environment of a Grab driver or a FedEx delivery guy or someone who's making fries in McDonald's or sitting in Citibank and answering a phone in a call center or whatever, right? How do we redesign those roles as the value needs to change, the cost needs to come down, the accessibility needs to be increased, right? And I think that type of complex organizational design merged with technology and that type of thinking is very exciting. You said something to me before we started filming around when you started Naluri, you actually kind of saw some similarities in how you approached it based on what you did before, even though the space was completely different. Could you talk a bit about that? Because I think that was really exciting.
So part of wanting to do Naluri was to, it started from a conversation about what's your purpose in life, right? You might know the Japanese concept of ikigai, right? So if you could find the intersection between kind of what you're good at, especially what will people pay you to do, what you're passionate about, if you didn't have to worry about money, what would you do? And then what are the big problems in the world that you care about, right? And so when I started having a conversation with someone and they asked me, well, what do you do? Well, I've been building these businesses, bringing together investors and business partners, hiring organizations, painting a vision, and trying to make things much more accessible to the mass market. Okay, passion. What are you passionate about? And my first impulsive reaction was, well, triathlons. Right now, of course, at 49, I'm not going to be a professional triathlete, but I love the whole aspect about tenacity and perseverance and focus and human performance and managing it quantitatively. I think one of the biggest differences I think between triathletes and say runners and cyclists is we're much more obsessed with data. Right? Like we measure everything, right? From heart rate variability, cadence, power, etc. And when it came to, what are the biggest problems in the world that you care deeply about, right? And I said, wow, okay. And what were the problems that you were tackling in your previous organizations? And the recurrent theme for me was the problem that I see in society today is that we're being more polarized. The haves and have-nots, that gap is growing, right? The middle class is not catching up. The 1% is getting further because of better education, better healthcare, better employment opportunities. And so if we could make things much more affordable and accessible for that mass market, we can do our part to close that gap. Right, so that was the idea why I was incredibly passionate about AirAsia X. How do you make long distance travel much more affordable? Right, so you don't have to pay a full service airline price to go to London or Sydney. And even with iFlix, it was, well, how do you make entertainment and television much more affordable, not for the people who already have a cable or satellite subscription, but those who only have a 3G connection and only 1 gigabyte of data a month, right? How do you make it work for them with content that's relevant to them, right? And so that's when someone said, well, given that you're passionate about kind of health and human performance and starting up businesses and using tech and solving this problem, why not start something about making health much more accessible and affordable to the mass market, right? And sometimes when you have these conversations, it might end just at that coffee shop talk. But sometimes something really stirs inside, right? And what stirred inside for me was, what immediately clicked was a personal experience, because I lost my father 9 years ago to diabetes and cancer. Now when you reflect on it, you realize the whole healthcare focus was just chemo this, medication that, surgery this, right? But when someone's going through that condition, we now today understand, wow, that's actually depression and anxiety and isolation and loneliness, because you can imagine, right?
Yeah.
When you get that diagnosis, you're thinking, well, what's going to happen to me? Who's going to take care of my family? What's going to happen to my job? Like, your whole sense of self is fleeting away. And doctors were not focused on that part, right?
Yeah.
And so that's why I felt, wow, imagine if we could help people, provide that kind of professional support, mental health, for those who are at risk of these chronic conditions.
Yeah, and making it affordable, accessible.
Yeah.
So in terms of what I'm kind of hearing is that there's by investigating your own purpose, you actually stumbled over a massive business opportunity and a meaningful one, which is an impact opportunity.
That's
in a
right.
sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's very much been the same for me when I started Human Inc. because I've been working with government here. I've been working with social impact stuff with like foundations and CSR. And I always felt like working with small social ventures, there was a lot of heart, there was a lot of purpose, but maybe not so much work and business experience was a bit lacking.
Right.
So it was very hard to make these social enterprises scalable.
Right.
The capital to flow to them would also be the kind of gift capital, donations, sponsorships, not really investors who's going to put them under pressure to say, well, you need to make money, you need to be sustainable, and I'll help you with that, right? So it was kind of off you go, right? A bit more in terms of it. And that is starting to change. I think that's very positive. But at the time, I became restless myself a bit. So I started asking myself, like, how can I both impact the world? How can I create a work environment that would make me excited every day? And where is it that there is also, how can I say, a business opportunity to be served that can make it not just giving and donating my time and sacrificing my own life, but at the same time, so it's kind of balancing between the financial side of things, creating impact, and having something that is also scary and new, because I was also like, I wanted to start something new. So that's kind of how I stumbled over by listening to some of the sponsors and mentors that we had in these incubators that I used to run.
Sure.
Then they were talking about, so our company says it wants to be innovative. So I said, could I come and visit your organization? I came into the big office there with all the cubicles and the ice cold air, and everyone was sitting there waiting for bus to go home, and bus stayed late, so they stayed late and then go through the jam, and So that's kind of how I stumbled over this, like, how can we imagine people like this in this environment coming up with anything that's customer-centric, innovative, creative, breakthrough, novel, right? What if we start actually working differently? What if we help these organizations discover the purpose, the heart, the connection, right? What have you learned in terms of how to develop new businesses, new value? What are your kind of tips for anyone sitting, maybe listening in terms of...
Well, I don't profess to say I have the formula.
No,
but what I can share is just my own experience. And after discovering, like, hey, that's a problem that I think is big, it's real, it's meaningful for me, I want to do this. And I think the key principle for me was to say, I needed to do this full time. Right? Because when you're full time, you're 100% focused, right? You're not, I've got my day job and all of that, because those distractions, those shorter term priorities will always take precedence, and this thing, the momentum dies off, right? So for me, it was 100% commit, number one. So that's a huge principle. Number two, no matter how good of an idea I have, I better not be wedded to that idea, and I need to stress test that idea. So as I was sharing with you, I spent 4 months just talking to people, right? Just talking to CEOs of insurance companies and corporate employers, HR directors, pharmaceutical companies, healthcare companies, doctors, to say, hey, this problem that I think is real, is it relevant to you, right? How high is it on your agenda?
Do you care?
Do you care about it, right? And here are some ideas that I have. Is this different from what you're already doing, right? And even through that process, we refine the original idea, right?
So kind of you had the idea roughly in mind, but by going out and
just
asking and listening more, you changed your definition of the problem, and therefore the solution.
Yes.
This is what we see a lot with kind of using design thinking as a method to get people to do that, because most people are like, but we already have the idea, it costs this much, can we just execute? We can get the budget,
You see, because I've gone, just to share anecdotes, right? Let's say, take iFlix, right? So first, even the idea of iFlix, right? Initially, over 100 people rejected the idea.
Wow.
The investors, because they said, well, there's already a giant in Silicon Valley. You guys are 5 guys in Mid-Valley, like you're not going to stand a chance, right? But luckily, you know, an investor did eventually come, and we funded and we were launched, and you know, 20 million subscribers across 20 countries in 3 years.
Yeah, wow.
But the difference is, as great as that Silicon Valley brand is globally, it's only for the upper segment here in Malaysia, and even smaller percentage in Indonesia, Vietnam, Myanmar, right? You need much more local content and local infrastructure and local payments to make it work for that segment. That was one part. But then when we first started, we said, okay, let's copy the model of, we'll give you a 30-day free trial, right? And after 30 days of free trial, you like our product, you can pay by credit card, online banking, etc. And it's only 10 ringgit a month. Right? Surely we felt, you know, if that's 10 times cheaper than your satellite TV subscription, that's a good deal, right? Well, once we launched, right, we now raise money. I think I spent like, you know, 10 million ringgit just on content rights in Malaysia alone. How many people converted? Probably only about 100 of my own friends and family members that I call them to say, hey buddy, please, right?
Or we're not friends anymore.
So 100 people, 10 ringgit a month for a year, that's, you know, 12,000 ringgit. That's not going to pay a lot of bills when your annual content cost is 10 million ringgit. And so that entire business plan collapsed. Wow. And that's when you're like, oh, what do we do? Serendipitously, I met someone and said, oh, you're from iFlix. Hey, I love your product, man. I'm on my 4th free trial. And then you realize, oh, you know, they like the product, just didn't like the idea of paying for it, right? Because if you make people pay for it, I'd rather than BitTorrent and pirate TV content.
Yeah.
The idea of paying for TV was just like abhorrent. That forced the thinking, well, at least people like the product. They just don't like the idea of paying for it. Now, who would benefit from having people watch more TV? And the light bulb moment came when we said telcos, because their business was going through an upheaval. 50% of their revenues were decimating because voice and SMS were disappearing. Data was their only revenue source. And guess what? Video is the most data-intensive application. It represents 70% of internet bandwidth, right? And so if you can get someone hooked on video, they're much more likely to consume more data, right?
Yeah, this is fascinating because the design thinker in me, and I'm obviously fairly biased here, is hearing that you discover these insights by asking, by paying attention, by listening to users, really wanting to understand what's going on for them and what is it about my current idea that isn't fully working commercially, but also maybe what is it that's not working for the customer, right? And that's where we're seeing a lot of value from kind of institutionalizing this way of working. Don't build anything for anybody unless you have talked to them first, listened to them first, observed them, looked at how they spend their money, spend their time, who they spend it with, how they go about buying anything, doing anything, and so on, right? But I guess the second part of that is, okay, you can go and listen, and you did that, but it could also, I would imagine, also sometimes be quite painful because you have invested money, time, and it's your awesome idea. So what's your advice for folks to kind of how to stay open when the data tells you what you don't want to hear, right? Because organizations love data that says that boss is right, investment was a great one. But when we get the other type of information, and that's typically not the CEO hearing the customer directly, maybe they should, but it's typically some team who's been researching that and bringing that data up, right?
Sure.
Maybe it moves a bit slower up when it's a bad news, right? Well, what's your advice? How can companies fix that?
So this is the classic problem of confirmation bias, right? Like we see things how we want to see things, right? And that is why for me that my main principle in life is it's important for you to have your mirrors. Mirrors are for me people who will really reflect things as is. Things that you sometimes don't want to hear, right? So who are your mirrors? And in a lot of big organizations, people don't have that objectivity because your colleagues, your bosses are all judging you, right? And so you're also not you're not willing to talk about the problems and the real feedback because how is this going to be perceived? And so where is that independent source, right? So in my case, for example, I have my own peer support group, right? A group of other CEOs. We've been together for 10 years. We see each other, 8, 10 times a year, right? And because you see that continuity and you develop a language where, when people share experiences, you don't judge, but you also share experiences and you try to take away what are the similarities or what are the unique insights,
what would that look like for
right?
me or us?
And so when you talk about these challenges and people are listening, first the act of having to explain it to someone that is objective, that actually clarifies a lot of thinking in you, right? And then when you hear them reflect back and you hear them talk about their stories, that starts to help you connect dots in ways that you wouldn't be able to do it otherwise. And so I think surrounding yourself with these right people who are willing to listen and willing to affirm what you're going through is real, and creating that safe space is hugely important.
Yeah, so I completely agree, and I guess two add-ons or views for me would be something around the safe space is often the hard part, right? But even before the safe space, do you have enough diversity? Because a lot of boards and C-suites are made of people who have very similar CVs and have studied the same things, worked in similar companies in the same industries, gotten promoted for the same kind of results. So, and I think we can even say to some extent we're guilty of that. We have a quite diverse workforce here in many, many ways. But there is obviously a little bit of a tendency that organizations will filter towards, probably from a Human Inc. standpoint, we want people who believe in our vision and mission and values, who want to humanize work and so on. So maybe we should have some people who almost don't believe in it, that would like challenge us more, like, nah, that doesn't make sense, money's more important, or I don't know. But like, could we welcome more diversity to get more real conversations? And then we would need the psychological safety and the leadership skills to make people comfortable sharing not so positive news or what might be perceived as critique or challenge. Yeah. Maybe should we pick another one?
Okay, all right.
We can see what's this.
Okay. Whew. A link between corporate well-being and employee engagement. Why don't you start with that?
we can co-create it. We'll spin it, right?
Okay.
So a link between corporate well-being and employee engagement. So I guess the question is a little bit around like, if people are physically well, emotionally well, how might that help a company have employees that feel excited about coming to work, doing work, working together, and maybe also, I guess that could also be the resilience part that as the world changes and changes again and changes more radically than ever before, how can we sustain well-being? Because I guess that's a big part of the challenge everyone is saying, both from an organizational standpoint and individual standpoint, I don't have time for well-being, right? But actually you don't have time not to be well, right? And being well helps you do well and so on. So I guess one take from me could be something around like, instead of thinking of well-being only as a cost saving on insurance and MC days, or optimizing productivity, could it also be seen as when, because that's what I'm taking away, correct me if I'm wrong, from what you're doing, is basically that you're linking behavioral science with health. That if we can understand how you understand yourself and what stresses you out and what affects your decision making, we can help you make decisions and therefore behavior that is healthy. So from an engagement standpoint, if you address this, the stress factor, then you have my interest. The only question is, employers need to be probably more mature than they are now. Because when we get employees to start talking about stress, that's when you get that mirror. Actually, how do we design to reduce that? We just had a conversation in Human Inc. because we're growing fast and we want to stay human, and we don't want that our success burns out our people. So what are the decisions we're making? And we literally had that conversation in our leadership team. What are the decisions we're making that helps our employees enjoy working here? What are decisions we're making where maybe we're too aggressive, we're too fast, we get too excited and too entrepreneurial too fast, right? Striking that type of balance. So that would be one take for me. It could be, actually, by talking about stress, we can create employee engagement, but at the same time, we might reduce some of those things, right? Yeah. Maybe what
Sure. Well, as you know, I'm extremely data obsessed. Right. And you even mentioned something which, while there is a clear correlation between your health and whether you're taking sick leave or your medical expenses, actually many companies don't even have a good view of that.
No, they don't track it well, they don't analyze it.
What they're tracking is how many claims, right? It's a very transactional data and what's the amount of claims. But they don't say, well, this person, what issues are they experiencing and what's the amount of claims, right? So sometimes we spend quite a bit of time cleaning up that data to move from transactional data to employee data, right? And so for example, in our case, we can then be able to show them this map that imagine if we first did a health assessment, right? If I measured your weight, your blood pressure, your blood sugar, your cholesterol, and your mental health. If you had all 5 out of 5 like at risk, because there are thresholds, right? Let's say BMI above 30, right? Or blood pressure above 140. What's your average medical claims for the last 3 years? What's your average sick leave over the last 3 years, right? And then if it's 4 out of 5, 3 out of 5, 2 out of 5. The fact that there is a very strong correlation, so for example, if you've got 5 out of 5, you're costing the company an average of about 18,000, 20,000 ringgit a year, right? So 4 out of 5 is about 12,000, right? 3 out of 5 is 6,008, 2 out of 5 is 4,008, and so forth. That alone is already wow, right? Because if you can see that correlation and you see, well, if we can now get people healthier, we can then move that curve to the left, right? And therefore you can then start to quantify the impact of it. And now that you actually have this data, look at your performance data, your employee engagement data, and you can then start to build correlations. So that's on one part in terms of the data at a snapshot, let's say on an annual basis. But what's more interesting from us is if we can now start engaging with our with the employees and the insurance customers, we use, for example, natural language processing to quantify various sentiments, right? So for example, if you were to type something like, I'm going to start going to the gym, we can tag that using NLP as that is a positive intention to change. But if you say something like, oh, my husband will never allow me to go to a gym, negative resistance to change, right? So kind of positive versus negative. And so you can now measure the amount of positive statements versus negative statements. And you can see some people kind of going through this positive momentum, and you can see it when they're coming down. You can then also quantify sentiment.
And moments.
Right, like when just from subtle changes to words, right? When someone is either kind of positive, upbeat, to suddenly it gets dark, right?
The blues.
And if it starts to come down, we can then proactively reach out to them and say, hey, what's going on now, right? And in the last 2.5 years, we've even picked or identified 6 cases of suicide ideation. Now, this is a breakthrough because traditionally, right, the way companies provide a help is say, here's a hotline, call if you need help. But the reality is only 2 to 3% of employees are picking up the phone call. But we know from our data, 30 to 40% of employees have elevated levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. So there's this big gap. But if we can now start to quantify, because we're engaging them about health, performance, how's work, how's finances, family, etc., and you notice these subtle changes, right? If suddenly there's a drop, we reach out to them and say, hey, what's going on now? Oh, 32-year-old female said, oh, thanks for reaching out. My husband's been traveling a lot. I'm stuck home with the kids. The kids have been sick. I don't have a support structure. Boss is on my case. I've got all these overdue projects. It's performance appraisal time. And I was thinking of ending my life, right? So she didn't reach out for help. But because we were there and she opened up, we were able to then intervene and kind of stabilize things and all of that. And so that is why once we can reimagine in a world where we move from kind of more static, one-off analysis to kind of a much more ongoing engagement and be able to quantify this kind of real, stress level data.
This is fascinating because I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle, but very similar in many ways, which is we have had an increasing number of clients ask us to help them kind of custom design especially people manager and leader frameworks or experience environment. What environment do you give junior managers? What environment do you give mid-level managers? What environment do you give senior leaders who are becoming senior leaders for the first time and so on? So in very similar ways, you can say we can get very highly relevant insights from what people are saying, what people are doing, take this data out, build kind of a persona around and say, these are the needs of people like this. The people who are highly stressed are also unhealthy. They also tend to log in longer hours or have more calls per week. How can we design for that challenge? How can we not just blame the individual, or maybe not even only give them coaching individually, but also is there some organizational changes we need to make? Maybe basically the teams are not structured right, or the expectations are wrong, or the support isn't right, or whatever, right? So I'm interested in this question between change driven by the individual and how can we provide an environment that gives them the support that they want and need at the right time, because it's also like when the kind of moments of truth. When is it that someone becomes suicidal? When is it someone stops caring about the organization they work for? When is it someone is feeling so overwhelmed that even though they love their team, they don't have the ability to show it, a bit like, maybe the classic father figure who loves the kids but don't know how to say it, or whatever, right? So what are those kind of experiences that helps the problem, and what are the kind of experiences we could design and provide that could be triggered by what people are saying, what people are doing? So I think maybe the last part of our coming here could maybe be interesting to talk a bit about the future, maybe, in terms of like, what would it look like? Maybe not in 30 years and maybe not in 30 days, but let's say 5-10 years, still a bit out there, right? What could be this sort of environment where if we should give some kind of snapshots? So what do you think would look different from a well-being at work kind of standpoint?
So here's my take on it. And the whole theme is how technology makes us more human.
Wonderful.
And so I had talked about, today Nullery uses natural language processing because our main mode of interface is text, right? So we analyze text to understand human emotion and sentiment. But the next step on our journey for us, for example, is how do we incorporate video? Because once I have video, right, I have two very interesting data sets. Number one, your face. Right? And number two, your audio, your sound, right? Dr. Tiffany Ong, my Chief Operations Officer, she did her PhD on microfacial expressions. Right? And so if you can then take that data on human emotion from subtle changes to your face, right? And by itself, it may not be extremely accurate, but if I now also have your words, and then I also have what you say audio, not just the words that you say, but the temper, the valence, the speed, you can then correlate and be even more precise in terms of human emotion, right? Now, of course, in our case, the application is so that we can provide that psychological support and that health coaching to help them stay on track to achieve their health goal. But you can also imagine how in fields like customer service, in terms of how teams understand each other, right? How bosses relate to subordinates. Because if we can be much more precise about how someone really feels, right? We can be much more personalized in terms of how we engage. Right? Because how I talk to a happy customer is going to be very different than when I talk to an upset customer. But not every upset customer is going to be screaming and shouting. Some people, they may just passive aggression, right? And so that's subtle.
Thank you so much for your help.
Exactly, right? Exactly.
Makasih banyak-banyak.
So I think that's what's exciting, where we use technology, but we actually create more human connection because we can now understand each other much more precisely than ever before. So we imagine a future where technology humanizes businesses, but also humanizes maybe relationships, right? So and this will help husbands, better have relationships with their wives, right? Like, wait, is she sarcastic or is she real, right? Now I know.
There's still hope, huh?
Yes.
or parents understand kids, or vice versa, right? I mean, there's a lot of opportunity for this kind of, when people are saying this, what is it they're trying to say, or how are they feeling? How am I understanding your reaction on the Zoom call as opposed to how you meant the reaction, right? Because I think that's also where we see in this kind of virtual work becoming very difficult is did I misread you? Did I overreact? Normally after leaving the meeting room, you could say something in the corridor. I mean, I didn't mean it that way, so I had to say it that way in front of boss or whatever. But now you don't really have that, or if you do, then it's like a text and then it's kind of sitting there, right? And what if that person is upset and forwards? And like everything is becoming a bit more kind of cold in a way. So I think that's a very interesting design challenge for the future of work is how do we bring people closer through technology, and how do we create more relevance, right? And I think there could be, one thing is kind of the bubble of technology, like the cost and possibilities is just mind-blowing and ever increasing. But there's also kind of the business case for this is therefore becoming much more viable. Things that might seem like very outlandish is actually just around the corner, or someone's already playing with it, right? But from a human kind of leadership standpoint, there's also a lot of the need for ethics, I guess, because for example, I heard someone talk about something somewhat similar around having video surveil employees in terms of, are they doing their work? Are they productive? Are they leading well? But also from a concern standpoint in terms of well-being and health and so on. So I think they had some like these kind of facial recognition from like security. They use it like to prevent like bombers in the metro or in the airport, but it's the same software can obviously be coded for other emotional expressions and so on. But it brings a lot of like ethical questions in. Also, let's say you worked in a company in China, where maybe that data might go to the government. That could also happen in other parts of the world, I'm sure. You know, how would you feel as an employee that Big Brother, in all the best intentions and to save cost, is surveilling you? So I think the need for these kind of ethics and transparency, with a stronger tool, we need even more kind of leadership and responsibility, I guess. But it's been a fascinating conversation, and really excited to. I'm going to actually sign up and once I'm out of this, get started swimming again, and hopefully more. Awesome. So really grateful you would come over, and a really exciting convo. So I really wish you all the best on the mission to bring affordable health and well-being to millions of people.
Thank you.
Thanks.